The operating room was a sanctuary of sterile steel and rhythmic beeping, but for Dr. Ava Thompson, it was a battleground. Beneath her hands lay Wonho Junki, a man whose name was whispered in fear across the LA underworld. 7 hours of precision, clamping arteries, stitching tragedy, saved a life that should have been lost to the darkness. She didn't know he was a monster. She only knew he was a patient. When he woke from his coma, he didn't find a judge or a jury, but a woman whose calm, unwavering strength made the violence of his world feel obsolete. He survived because of her brilliance. He lived because of her humanity. But blood has a long memory. 15 years earlier, Wonho had wiped out an entire rival bloodline to secure his throne, leaving a single boy, Daeho Jasung, as a ghost of his cruelty. Now that ghost has come to collect. As the first shots ring out in a Santa Monica parking lot, the life Ava built, the life she earned, is shattered. Wonho realizes too late that the past isn't behind him, it is standing right in front of him, gun in hand. The ICU was a different world, a landscape of humming monitors and the clinical scent of antiseptic. Wonho Junki, a man accustomed to the frantic, blood-slicked reality of his empire, found himself anchored to a bed, his world reduced to the four walls of a private room. For the first week, he was a silent prisoner of his own anatomy, trapped in a narcotic haze. When the fog finally lifted, the first thing he saw was not a subordinate or a rival, but the steady, unflinching eyes of Dr. Ava Thompson. She wasn't checking his vitals with the mechanical detachment of a nurse. She was observing him, measuring his recovery with a quiet intensity that felt more invasive than any bullet. "You're lucky, Mr. Junki," she said, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to the harsh beeping of the ventilator. "Most people don't survive that level of trauma. Most people don't get a second chance." Wonho tried to speak, but the tubes hindered him. He could only watch her. He had lived his life surrounded by people who feared him, people who worshipped him, and people who plotted his downfall. He had never met someone who looked at him and saw only a patient, a human being in need of repair. Her hands, when she adjusted his forelines or checked his surgical site, were precise and gentle. There was no hesitation in her, no flicker of the submissiveness he was used to eliciting from others. She held his life in her hands, and yet, she treated him as if he were just an ordinary man. It was unnerving. It was infuriating. And, he realized with a jolt that nearly spiked his heart rate monitor, it was intoxicating. Over the next 2 weeks, the dynamic shifted. As he grew stronger, their conversations, brief at first, then lingering, became the highlight of his long, stagnant days. He found himself asking about her life, her studies, the reasons she chose to work in the trenches of a downtown hospital. She spoke with a passion for healing that reminded him of his own ruthless drive for power, but hers was built on creation, not destruction. He began to notice the small things, the way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear, the weary slump of her shoulders after a double shift, the subtle way she smiled when he finally made a joke that broke through her professional veneer. By the time he was cleared for discharge, the man who had walked into that hospital a ruthless king was gone. In his place was someone hollowed out and refilled with a strange, burgeoning hope. As he stood up, steadying himself against the bedside table, he looked at her one last time. "When I walk out of here," he said, his voice raspy but firm, "I'm taking you on a real date." Ava laughed, a sound like glass chimes, but she didn't pull away. And for the first time in his life, Wonho knew exactly what he wanted, and it wasn't an empire. The transition from hospital gown to tailored suit was a jarring reminder of the life Wonho had temporarily stepped away from. Yet, even as he resumed the mantle of a feared syndicate leader, the ghost of the hospital room followed him. The halls of his estate, once echoing with the cold, calculated whispers of his lieutenants, now felt cavernous and suffocating. He remembered his parting words to Ava, a challenge born of an impulse he couldn't explain. He had expected her to dismiss him, to see him as just another ego-driven man seeking a favor. Instead, she had looked at him with that same steady, unblinking clarity that had unnerved him while he was under her care. The date was set for a Friday. Wonho chose a discreet, high-end restaurant in Beverly Hills, a place where he was known, but where he insisted on absolute privacy. When Ava arrived, she wasn't wearing the scrubs that had become his symbol of salvation. She wore a simple, elegant dress, her hair loose, her expression guarded but curious. Throughout the evening, Wonho found himself struggling to navigate the space between his two selves. He wanted to impress her, to show her the power he wielded, yet he felt a strange, nagging shame in letting her see the machinery of his violence. Every time he went to boast, he stopped. He found himself asking her about her work, about the small joys of her life, about anything that didn't involve the cold weight of his holster. "You're not the man they talk about," Ava said softly over wine, her eyes searching his. "I'm the man I want to be when I'm with you," Wonho replied, the honesty catching him off guard. It was a dangerous admission. In his world, desire was a weakness, and truth was a currency spent only to manipulate. But sitting across from her, the city lights shimmering through the window, the violence of his past felt like a distant, dying storm. He watched the way she navigated the conversation, unimpressed by his status, yet deeply affected by his genuine attempts to connect. Before the night ended, Wonho walked her to her car. The cool LA air felt sharp against his skin. He didn't use the grand gestures his advisors suggested. He simply looked at her, his posture losing the rigid, defensive tension he had carried for years. "I don't just want to date, Ava," he said, the silence between them heavy with intent. "I want you to know me, the real me, not the king, not the monster, just the man who wants to walk a different path." She didn't promise him anything, but she didn't walk away. She nodded, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. As she drove off, Wonho stood on the curb, the city beneath his feet, realizing that for the first time, he was no longer fighting for control. He was fighting for a future. 6 years vanished like smoke in the wind. The transition hadn't been instantaneous, but it was absolute. Wonho had dismantled his empire with the same cold, tactical efficiency he had once used to build it. He liquidated assets, severed ties with syndicates, and rebranded his holdings into a logistics corporation that operated entirely within the light of the law. The suburbs of Los Angeles provided the perfect backdrop for their quiet revolution. Their home was a sprawling, sun-drenched sanctuary, free from the echoes of sirens or the heavy silence of bodyguards. Inside, the only tension came from the chaotic joy of their children, Jace and Mira. Ava remained the heartbeat of their family. She had stepped back from the grueling pace of trauma surgery to focus on private practice, allowing her to be present for morning breakfasts and bedtime stories. She was the one who taught Jace how to ride a bike and the one who soothed Mira after her first nightmare. For Wonho, this domesticity was an alien landscape, one he navigated with a sense of reverent awe. He watched them from the kitchen island, a coffee mug warming his hands, feeling a profound sense of disbelief. He had spent his youth bracing for impact, expecting a bullet or a betrayal at every turn. Now, his greatest challenge was negotiating the bedtime routine, or helping Jace with a math project. He often caught himself looking at Ava, the way her laugh still anchored him, the way her eyes still possessed that same piercing clarity that had saved his life all those years ago. She was the architect of the peace he finally inhabited. He had become a husband who took pride in the mundane, a father who learned to soften his voice, and a man who had successfully buried his former identity under layers of suburban normalcy. The shadows were gone, or so he believed. One evening, after a celebratory dinner in Santa Monica to mark his corporate anniversary, Wonho stood on the sidewalk watching his family. Jace was laughing at something Mira said, and Ava was tucked against his side, her head resting on his shoulder. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and freedom. He leaned down and kissed her temple, whispering, "We made it." Ava smiled, her eyes reflecting the glowing lights of the pier. "We did," she agreed, her voice soft with contentment. Wonho looked out at the horizon, the city lights shimmering like distant stars. He felt a rare, expansive sense of security. He had paid for his past in blood, sweat, and the absolute destruction of his old life. He was a different man now, standing in a future he had painstakingly earned. He believed the debt was settled, the balance cleared. He didn't notice the silver sedan idling in the shadows across the street, nor the eyes tracking them from the darkness, eyes that were burning with a decade and a half of grief. The past hadn't forgotten. It had simply been waiting for him to finally feel safe. 10 miles away from the warmth of the Santa Monica boardwalk, a man sat in the dim interior of a rental apartment, staring at a wall covered in photographs. This was Daeho Jasung. At 25, he possessed the sharp, angular features of his father, but his eyes held a hollow, jagged intensity that belonged to no one but himself. For 15 years, those walls had been his only company. Every photograph was a piece of a puzzle he had spent a lifetime assembling: the construction of Wonho's logistics empire, the address of his suburban estate, the school schedules of 2 children named Jace and Mira, and the glowing, curated life of a woman named Ava. Daeho traced his finger over a printed image of Wonho and Ava leaving the restaurant. In the photo, Wonho looked older, softer, his shoulders stripped of the tension that once defined his lethal posture. He looked happy. That happiness was an insult. Daeho remembered the night the world ended. He was 10, hiding behind a heavy velvet curtain in his father's study, clutching a toy soldier while the sound of gunfire ripped through his home. He remembered the silence that followed, the terrifying, absolute silence of parents who would never wake up again. He had grown up in the bitter foster system of the U.S., his childhood replaced by the gnawing, cold ambition of a boy who knew exactly who had stolen his future. He had watched Wonho's reformation from the periphery, his rage curdling into a dark, calculated patience. Wonho hadn't just killed his father. He had replaced his family with a perfect, imitation version of one. Daeho stood up, his movements fluid and predatory. He moved to the small table in the corner where a heavy black pistol lay next to a pair of gloves. He didn't feel like a monster. He felt like an accountant. He had spent years tallying up the cost of his grief, and tonight, he was finally ready to balance the ledger. He didn't want to kill Wonho immediately. Killing him would be too quick, too merciful. He wanted Wonho to watch. He wanted the man who had destroyed a family to experience the exact, visceral realization that he had built his paradise on a foundation of quicksand. He pulled on the gloves, the leather stretching tight over his knuckles. The plan was etched into his mind with the clarity of a death warrant. He walked to the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He thought of his mother's face, fading from his memory, and his father's last, frantic words. "I am the consequence," he whispered to the empty room. He checked the magazine one last time, the metallic click echoing like a heartbeat. He walked out the door, leaving behind the shrine of photos. The ghost of the past was finally moving toward the light, and it brought a storm with it. The air in Santa Monica was cooling, a gentle breeze coming off the Pacific that carried the faint scent of sea salt and street food. Wonho held the car door open for Ava, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. They were laughing, the punchline of a joke Jace had told earlier still lingering in the air. "I think we should take them to the coast next weekend," Wonho said, his voice dropping into that relaxed, intimate tone he reserved only for her. "Just us, the kids, and zero schedules." Ava turned to face him, her eyes bright under the glow of the street lamps. "I'd love that, Wonho. It's been..." The world shattered. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but the sharp, rhythmic crack-crack-crack of a silenced pistol that sliced through the evening peace. Wonho's instincts, dormant for 15 years, yet never truly erased, screamed a warning. He lunged, his body moving by muscle memory, shoving Ava toward the heavy iron frame of the restaurant entrance. "Get down," he roared, his voice stripping away the suburban veneer to reveal the commander he used to be. He didn't make it in time. A crimson blossom bloomed across Ava's silk blouse. She crumpled, not with a cry, but with a sickening, heavy silence, collapsing onto the pavement. The valet station erupted into chaos. Patrons scrambled, chairs overturned, and the rhythmic screech of tires filled the air. Wonho dropped to his knees, his hands frantically pressing against the wound in Ava's side. The blood was warm, slick, and terrifyingly bright against her skin. It was the same color as the blood he had once seen on the operating table the night he had entered her life. But this time, it was his own sin coming home to roost. He looked up, scanning the shadows. Across the street, standing perfectly still near the mouth of a dark alley, was a figure. It wasn't a random hitman. The man's posture, the way he stood with the quiet, hollow grace of a predator, hit Wonho with the force of a physical blow. He didn't know the face, but he knew the eyes. They were the eyes of the boy he had left behind in the wreckage of a life long ago. The shooter didn't fire again. He simply stood there, watching the carnage he had orchestrated, his expression devoid of triumph, only a cold, hollowed-out satisfaction. Then, he turned and vanished into the darkness of the alleyway. "Ava? Ava, look at me!" Wonho screamed, his voice raw. He ignored the sirens wailing in the distance. He had spent years trying to erase the monster he used to be, but as he felt his wife's pulse flickering beneath his bloodied fingers, he realized the monster had simply been hiding, waiting to drag his world down into the dark with him. The ambulance ride was a blur of flashing strobes and the rhythmic, agonizing pulse of life support machines. Wonho sat on the jump seat, his hands still stained with the drying, copper-scented blood of his wife. The paramedic was working with frantic intensity, his voice drowned out by the roar of the siren, but Wonho heard nothing. He was trapped in a sensory loop of the moments before the shots. Ava's laughter, the cool night air, and then the sudden, violent rupture of their world. When they arrived at the trauma center, the very same hospital where they had first met, the doors flew open. The medical team moved with a synchronized, terrifying efficiency that Wonho knew all too well. He watched as they transferred Ava to the gurney. She looked so small, so fragile, tethered to the machines that were now the only things standing between her and the void. "You can't come in, sir," a nurse said, placing a firm hand on his chest. Wonho stood frozen in the doorway of the trauma bay. For a fleeting second, he saw himself, not as he was now, but as he had been years ago, lying on that very same table. The irony was a jagged blade in his throat. He had saved a life once to earn his own, and now, the universe was collecting on the debt. He retreated to the waiting room, a sterile, fluorescent-lit purgatory. He didn't call the police, he didn't call his security detail. He sat in a rigid plastic chair, his head in his hands, forcing himself to breathe. He needed to think. He closed his eyes, replaying the image of the man in the alley. The cold, hollow eyes. The realization hit him with the weight of a collapsing building. The son of Co. Daejin had come for him. The logic was cold and inescapable. He had taken everything from the boy, and now the boy had come to take everything from him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from his lawyer, a notification from his business partner, but he ignored them. He was no longer the CEO of a logistics firm. He was a man with a gun in his safe and a lifetime of secrets he thought he had buried. He looked at his hands, still dark with his wife's blood. The rage that had once been his engine flickered to life, hot and dangerous. But as he looked at the empty hallway where the doctors fought for Ava's life, the rage transformed into something far more agonizing: clarity. If he answered this with violence, if he hunted the boy down to end the cycle, he would lose. Not just the physical fight, but the last 6 years of his soul. He stood up, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He knew where the boy would be. He didn't need a weapon to finish this. He needed the truth. The drive to the city's industrial district felt like a descent into the underworld. The skyscrapers of Los Angeles gave way to rusted warehouses and flickering streetlights, a landscape Wonho hadn't traversed in over a decade. He parked his car blocks away from the address he had pulled from his old, encrypted contact files, the only trail he had left. He didn't bring a weapon. He didn't bring backup. He walked with his hands open, his coat discarded to reveal he was unarmed. The weight of his past was heavy, but for the first time, he wasn't carrying it to use as a shield or a hammer. He was carrying it to lay it down at the feet of the man he had created. He found Daeho in a derelict storage facility, the interior illuminated by the blue-gray hum of a city skyline through broken windows. Dae-ho was waiting, a handgun resting on a crate in front of him. When he saw Won-ho, he didn't reach for the weapon immediately. He stood, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with the cold fire of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I thought you'd come with a private army," Dae-ho said, his voice raspy, laced with a tremor of shock. "I came for you," Won-ho replied, his voice steady. He stopped 10 feet away, refusing to cross the line into aggression. "I know who you are. I know what I took from you." Dae-ho scoffed, though the sound lacked malice. It was a sound of pure, concentrated pain. "You took everything. You built a kingdom on the grave of my parents, and then you had the audacity to play husband and father in the suburbs. Did you ever sleep, Won-ho? Or did you just wait for the nightmare to come?" "Every night," Won-ho admitted. He stepped forward, just a fraction. He saw Dae-ho's hand twitch toward the gun, but he didn't retreat. "I spent 6 years trying to outrun the man I was. I thought if I did enough good, if I gave enough, the balance would shift. But I was wrong." "You killed them," Dae-ho hissed, finally grabbing the gun. He leveled it at Won-ho's chest. The barrel didn't shake. "You ended my world. And you think a conversation balances that ledger?" "I think the cycle ends here," Won-ho said, looking down the barrel of the gun with an eerie, calm focus. "You want to kill me? Pull the trigger. It won't bring them back and it won't heal you. It will only turn you into the person I was 15 years ago. A ghost. A man who only knows how to destroy." Won-ho opened his arms, exposing his chest. "Take the shot if you have to. But look at me first. See the man you're about to become." The silence in the warehouse was deafening. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that 2 lifetimes of blood were hanging in the balance, waiting to see if history would repeat or finally break. Dae-ho's finger tightened on the trigger, his knuckle white against the dark steel. The warehouse was so quiet that Won-ho could hear the distant hum of the city, a cruel reminder of the life he was prepared to forfeit. "My father wasn't a good man," Dae-ho whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his own bitterness. "But he was mine. You didn't just kill him, Won-ho. You erased the only version of myself that was ever happy." Won-ho didn't flinch. He walked closer until the muzzle of the gun was inches from his chest. "I know. I told myself I did it for control, for survival, but that was a lie. I did it because I was arrogant and I was cruel. I looked at your family and saw obstacles, not people. I robbed you of your future to feed my own ego." He let out a long, shuddering breath, the first time he had truly spoken the truth aloud in 15 years. "I thought I could hide behind a mortgage and a career. I thought if I played the part of a good man long enough, I would eventually become one. But you are the consequence I earned. If you kill me, I die the monster I was. But if you walk away, you choose a different path." "Why should I?" Dae-ho's eyes filled with tears, the cold, hollow mask finally shattering. He wasn't a hitman in that moment. He was a grieving boy standing in the wreckage of a life. "Why should you get to keep your wife and your children when I have nothing?" "Because," Won-ho said, his voice dropping to a raw, broken plea, "the woman you shot, the woman currently fighting for her life in the surgery room, she is the only reason I am a man worth saving. If she dies, I die. If she lives, it's because she taught me that life is not about the debts we collect, but the grace we offer." Dae-ho stared at him, the gun heavy in his hand. The rage that had fueled him for a decade, the singular, burning purpose that had kept him alive, suddenly felt like ash in his mouth. He looked at Won-ho and didn't see the invincible boss anymore. He saw a man terrified, vulnerable, and utterly broken. Slowly, agonizingly, Dae-ho lowered the weapon. He let it clatter onto the concrete floor. The sound was small, but it signaled the end of a war that had raged for 15 years. Dae-ho slumped against a rusted support beam, covering his face with his hands. The sobbing that followed was the sound of a boy finally grieving his parents, no longer distracted by the need to kill. Won-ho didn't move toward him, respecting the distance. "I can't undo it," Won-ho said softly, "but I can help you build the life you lost. If you ever need help, real help, you come to me." Dae-ho didn't look up, but he nodded. The cycle was broken.